Hello everyone, it's Hugh here at Loxone, and I would like to give you a short video today to show you how to configure the presence sensor with Loxone Config. This will be a video going over the presence sensor, its various inputs, its various parameters, and then how we configure that within config using primarily the presence block. So without further ado, let's get started. So what I have in front of here before me is just a blank config file where I have pre-learnt in some devices. One of these devices is a presence sensor. This could either be the flush mount or the surface mount presence sensor. It doesn't really matter. The first thing we have to do on going onto this presence sensor is take a look at a few of its parameters. So as well as the normal parameters like its name, its room, there are also a few additional ones which have been implemented since the release of the presence sensor. The first two of these parameters are volume thresholds. So the reason that it's called the presence sensor rather than the motion sensor is, as well as having a motion sensor within it, it also has an acoustic sensor as well. The idea being is that the presence input gets triggered once motion has gone off and then followed by an acoustic signal. So for instance, motion always has to be the first trigger of presence. But once motion has triggered, acoustic signal, noise, can then be used to continue that presence input. And at what level of noise continues that presence input is set here within the thresholds. So you have a presence threshold and a sound level alarm threshold. The reason being, if we take a look at the inputs within the sensor itself, you will see that there is a presence input and a sound level alarm input. The presence input is primarily what we'll be covering today. This is what you will use to trigger lighting, to extend heating, to trigger audio, so on and so forth. The sound level alarm has no default functionality, but it could be used, for instance, in an ambient assisted living scenario to get a notification if somebody yells or shouts out. So back to the sensor, we then have these two volume thresholds. The easiest way to correctly set these volume thresholds is when you are connected to your mini server and you have your sensor learnt in, to very simply click Edit under Volume Thresholds. This will open up a graph here that will show you the green line, which is your presence line, the red line, which is your sound level alarm. This yellow line down here is motion, which you'll see if I trigger the sensor, the yellow line rises. And then you also have your grey and your black lines. Those are your minimum and your maximum volumes over that period of time. So if this were my normal day-to-day noise that I was making in my office space, what I would do is I would aim to have my presence threshold peaking every few seconds from my normal background noise. So I would have it maybe around there, maybe even a touch higher, so that it's just peaking, as you can see, every few seconds. My sound level alarm threshold, that should be high enough that for my normal daily use in this room isn't going to trigger that, but for instance a smashing of a window or a very loud noise like me yelling out would then trigger it. So that's then my volume level for presence set and my volume level for alarm set. Once those are done, press accept. Following on from this, there are a few new parameters that have also been added since version 11 of config. These are overruns. So if you had a motion sensor, you would only have the overrun duration for motion. If you have a presence sensor, you will have this plus an overrun duration for presence. The idea behind these is that obviously motion and presence could be triggering very, very frequently. A motion sensor within a space could be triggering multiple times a second. And if we have multiple motion sensors or presence sensors within one property, we could have a lot of packets being sent across the tree network back to the mini server. That could cause latency issues, it could slow down the tree branch, and it could cause us various problems throughout the installation. So what we do is we only send a trigger of motion or presence once every X number of seconds from the detector. So for instance, if I wasn't making any sound, but I triggered motion on this sensor and then immediately stopped triggering motion, this motion input here would actually stay on for 60 seconds, even though there was no longer any motion. That is because of this parameter here. So it will hold the last trigger of motion on for 60 seconds. So any parameters you set on things like lighting controllers, always expect them to stay on for that amount of time after you expect them to. That is fine. In a normal, everyday situation, an extra 60 seconds in a room really has no bearing. This can be set as low as 2 seconds, but if you do change it, please be aware of the ramifications it could have on a wider system. Provided it's not a massive system, there is no inherent risk in changing it. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to set that to 2 seconds. And just like we have on motion, we also have an overrun time for presence. This means that if I were to trigger the sensor and then make a noise, if I then immediately walked out of the room, the presence input of the sensor would stay on for the overrun for motion, followed by the overrun for presence. So I would have 302 seconds of overruns there. You don't need to change the presence overrun. The reason being is that, as per the description down here, the overrun time is taken from the presence block when the presence block is used. So provided you are using the presence function block with this device, you do not need to set the overrun time for presence. The only time in which you would need to set the overrun time for presence is if you were to directly connect the presence input from the sensor into an MV, which is a motion input of a certain function block, such as the lighting controller. So I'm not going to change this one. There is also a volume transmission cycle. This means that you can see here there is a minimum and maximum volume inputs. Those are analogs. They will update every 300 seconds with the minimum and maximum volume over that time period. That could be used, for instance, for tracking. There is also a transmission cycle for brightness. So rather than constantly retransmitting the brightness level, the current lux level, what it will do is it will retransmit it either every 900 seconds or on a change greater than 30%, which is fine. Again, it is for transmission reasons on tree or air that we're not constantly sending it. It really doesn't need to be touched, because greater than 30%, it's instantly going to change anyway. So those are the various parameters for the sensor. Once you've understood those, we then come on to config. If we take our most fundamental function block that we understand presence or motion being used in, that would be a lighting controller, where obviously we have motion or presence to turn on lights, and then after a predefined timeout, we turn off lights. You will notice that the input that was always previously used for sensors was the MV input. The MV input is specifically designed for motion sensors. We are going to use the P input moving forward for presence sensors. The reason being is that within the lighting controller, we have 3 parameters related to motion or presence based switch off of lighting. We have TH. TH determines that if the lights were last activated through motion, that they will turn off after this amount of time with no motion being active on the MV input. So for instance, if I activated a motion sensor and lights turned on, and I then left the room, and the motion sensor went off, so therefore the MV input was low, then after this amount of time, lights would turn off. The TH timer here within the lighting controller only applies to the MV input. It does not apply to the P input. The P input does not pay any heed to the TH timer in the function block. The reason being is that, as we have just discussed, the presence sensor itself has an overrun. So if we were to tie the presence sensor into MV there, we would end up with 2 overruns. We would end up with the overrun of the sensor itself of 300 seconds, plus the overrun within the lighting controller as well for 900 seconds, which would obviously be incorrect. So TH only applies to the MV input. The P input, by comparison, is that as soon as the P input goes off, the lights turn straight off if they were brought on through presence. So if presence brings the lights on, they instantly go off once the P input goes low. That's because the overrun timer is now taken out of the lighting controller and moved somewhere else. We will get to where that's been moved in a minute. The other parameters we have on the lighting controller is TI. TI is the delay of the sensor. Now this applies to both the MV and the P input. Basically what this means is if the lights were manually turned off, either through switch or app, the sensor is disabled from bringing lights back on for this period of time. The reason being is that if I'm leaving the room and I've double tapped to turn the lights off from the switch, I don't instantly want the lights to turn back on because the sensor has caught my back. So if you have manually turned the lights off through either switch or app, the TI timer will then disable the sensor from turning lights back on for that period of time. It has to have this complete period of time with the P or the MV inputs being off before they can turn lights back on again. So any re-trigger of motion or presence during this countdown will restart the countdown. And then the final parameter related to motion or presence-based lighting is MT. Again, MT applies to both the MV and the P input. MT means that if your lights have had a manual interaction, for instance, you have manually overridden the mood via either the switch or the app to another mood, it is still an automatic switch off of the light, but it is a longer timeout. So if I've pressed the switch to manually change the lights in my living room to movie mood, I have done a manual override. And therefore, once I leave the room, if I have not manually turned the lights off, the lights will turn off after this amount of time without presence or motion being there. So TH, TI, MT. TH is only applicable to the MV input, whereas TI and MT are applicable to both MV and P. And that gets us onto the next thing of where, or rather what goes on to P. We could tie our presence input from our sensor directly on P, and that would work. There would be nothing wrong with this functionality. However, for any amendment of the timer, of the overrun time, as I said, is not TH here, we would have to do it within the sensor itself, the overrun for presence and motion. That obviously means that we are giving no capability to our consumer to change this timer should they need to, and also no simple way to track that the timer is still active. So instead, what we've decided to do, and because there are more blocks than just the lighting controller that rely on motion or presence, we've decided to move them into their own block, called the presence block. The presence block takes all inputs in the room that can be linked to motion or presence and uses it to determine whether somebody is in the space or not. So as you see, when I add the presence block to a page, I have the option of my ceiling sensor, which is my presence sensor, or my switch, or both. So one or both of these could be made a presence input. I'm going to choose just the sensor for demonstration purposes and press OK. The sensor is now intrinsically linked within this block. This block's output, P-bin, then links to the P input of your lighting controller, not the MV input. The reason being is that the TH parameter that I just mentioned that's built into the lighting controller that only applies to MV, the reason it doesn't apply to P as well is because the presence block has its own TH timer built in. So this is now where you define your TH timer for whatever you want it to be. For demonstration, I'm going to set that to 10 seconds and I'm going to set the switch off warning to 5 seconds. The reason I said that in the presence sensor itself you didn't need to worry about the overrun duration for presence is because when you are using the presence block, the overrun time for presence follows whatever is set in its respective presence block. So that's why the overrun duration for motion does matter, because that will always extend this output here. However, the presence overrun is taken directly from your presence block. So no extra need to touch anything there. The presence block can also be activated by other means. Any additional third-party input that you would like to use to activate presence can go into the iAct input. We also would discuss at, say, nighttime, disabling motion or presence in, say, a bedroom from activating lights automatically. That used to be done through an input called dismv. That input is now labelled disp, D-I-S-P, and it is true for both the presence and the motion input, the P and the MV input. As long as DISP is active, motion or presence will not automatically bring on lights. So let's just finish this off by adding in a light, and we will also add in a switch to show you this all working. And then with the presence block, also you can tie it to any other function block that has an applicable input. For instance, it could go into the P input of the audio player as well. And then I'm going to save that into the mini server. Once I've saved that into the mini server, I'll open up the Loxone app to show you. So one of the primary reasons that we like the use of the Loxone app and for the presence block itself is that the presence block is shown on the app. So if I head over to my living room, you can see in the living room that I have a presence block. As you can see, presence is currently not active. And if I also, in the same time, go into live view here in config, you can see that my lights aren't on. So no presence active, lights currently not on. But as I showed you with the graph of the thresholds for volume, I'm already speaking at a level that is high enough to activate presence. But as I said, sound cannot be the first trigger for presence. It always has to be motion first. Otherwise, our TV in our living room could turn our lights in our kitchen on. That would be incorrect. So I have to first of all trigger motion, which I'm going to do now. And there we have presence active. We just went to eco screen, but you can see there presence is now active and my lighting has turned on automatically. If I now cover my sensor, but I continue talking, that will keep presence active because again, my volume level is above the threshold that I set. If I'm now quiet for 10 seconds, oh, apparently I wasn't above the threshold that I had set. So I've lowered my speaking volume, which means that I'm now below my threshold, which means that you can see, there we go, I just peaked back above my threshold again. So you can see, obviously I'd lowered my speaking volume, which meant I was then under my presence threshold, but again, I did it again. So lights have gone off, but I have 10 seconds after lights have automatically deactivated to go back above my presence threshold, and it will automatically reactivate the sensor for me, which will automatically turn lights back on. So that is how the presence sensor and presence-based lighting works. Motion is the original trigger, and then even if you stop triggering motion, you can continue the sensor being active through an audible signal that is above your presence threshold. If you hit the TH timer within the presence block without an acoustic or motion trigger, the presence block goes off, which will in turn turn the lighting off if presence had brought the lighting on. You have 10 seconds after that point to reactivate the sensor through noise, which will then bring the lights back on. Otherwise, again, it has to be motion as the first trigger. The reason that the presence block is nice is, as you can see, it shows me that presence is active, it shows me when it's been active since, and it will also show you a list of history as well. Finally, expert settings. Within the app, you have this option here for expert settings. Provided someone has this permissions, they don't have to have config as well, they can edit parameters within the app. This gives your customer, therefore, the power to change this overrun time themselves. One simple parameter. If they make a mistake, it won't affect functionality elsewhere on the system. It will literally affect this one thing, which is presence. And then we have the presence sensor. So again, quick go over. Motion and acoustic equals presence. Motion on its own triggers both, but sound on its own triggers nothing. You always have to have motion first before sound. The sensor has several overrides built in, as well as several volume thresholds. The overrun time for presence doesn't need to be changed, however, because it will take that from the presence sensor block itself. As many sensors as you like can be assigned within this block, and any additional sensors can be added to iAct. Thank you all ever so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned something new. As always, please keep your eyes tuned for any new videos we do in the future. And any questions, please get in touch with us. Thank you very much. Goodbye.